Our lesson title for today is comparing numbers and distance from zero. So in that phrase right there, distance from zero, light bulbs should be going off in your head because in yesterday's lesson we discussed that the distance from zero is what we like to call absolute value. So our three learning targets. I can explain what absolute value means in situations involving elevation. We touched on that a little yesterday. I can use absolute values to describe elevations. And I can use inequalities to compare rational numbers and the absolute values of rational numbers. So we've been working a little bit with inequalities over the past week. Today, though, we're going to do so using absolute values as well. So for our warm-up today, it's called opposites. So it says the variable a has a value of 3. So we're given a variable a, and they're telling us that a equals 3. So we need to plot that on the number line. Here's 0. This is positive, so that means it's to the right. 1, 2, 3 spaces. So here's a, which is 3. Based on where you plotted a, plot negative a, or the opposite of a, on the same number line. So I want to take this important note that a negative sign in front of a variable means the opposite value. Okay, and that'll make more sense in a second here. So based on where you plotted a, plot the opposite of a or negative a on the same number line. So if a is 3, then the opposite of a would be negative 3. And that would be positive is to the right, negative is to the left, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. So here's our negative a, which is negative 3. Now, Noah said if a is a rational number, negative a will always be a negative number. Do you agree or disagree? So the answer is actually disagree. Because if a is negative, so for example, what if I told you that a is negative 3? Okay, so that's possible. You can have a value for a variable that's negative, because if a is negative, then negative a would be positive. Because once again, that's why I had us take that note, is that when we're dealing with negatives in front of a variable, it's not just saying like that's a negative variable. Negatives in front of a variable means just the opposite value. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit different than normal numbers. With negatives, like a negative in front of a number always means a negative number, but a negative in front of a variable just means the opposite of that variable. So if a was negative 3, then negative a would be positive 3, because negative a just means the opposite of a. Or if a was 0, then the opposite of a would also be 0, because as we discussed, 0 is its own opposite. Okay. So this next page is called submarine. So once again, we're talking about elevation. A submarine is at an elevation of negative 100 feet, which means 100 feet below sea level. Negative is always down. Let's compare the elevations of these 4 people to that of the submarine. And so we have Claire, Andre, Han, and Lynn. So why don't you pause the video and go ahead and read those to yourself really quick. So now we have a table here. So we have the 4 people that were mentioned before, and we need to take their situations and we need to come up with a possible elevation. So really there is an infinite amount of answers to these questions, but based on the number we choose, we then need to write an inequality and then describe their distance from sea level. So Claire was already done for us. So let's see where these numbers came from. Okay, so it says Claire's elevation is greater than the elevation of the submarine. Okay, greater than the elevation of the submarine. So if the submarine is 100 feet below sea level, then her elevation must be higher than that. Whether it was 50 feet below sea level, that's higher than being 100 feet down, or if her elevation was positive 5,000, right, that's above the elevation of the submarine. However, there's a stipulation as well. So Claire also must be farther from sea level than the submarine. So we chose the number 150 feet as her elevation for two reasons. One, the elevation is higher, and also because the distance from sea level is 150 feet. So 50 feet, she is 50 feet farther from sea level. So for instance, let's say we said that her elevation was 50 feet. So 50 feet, that elevation is higher than negative 100. So that works there, but the distance from sea level, 50 is only 50 feet from sea level, and her distance from sea level also needs to be greater than the submarine, so 50 would not work. It's the elevation's higher, but its distance from zero is not more, so that wouldn't work. So we need to kind of think about two different things at once as we're choosing our numbers. So Andre's elevation is less than the elevation of the submarine, and he also must be farther away from sea level than the submarine. So go ahead and pick some numbers and try and complete this table yourself, and then you can resume the video to check your work. So if his elevation is less than the submarine, I'm going to say his elevation is negative 200 feet. So his elevation is less. It's 100 feet deeper, 100 feet further down. And I know that negative 200 is less than negative 100. So perfect. And it also said that Andre is farther away from sea level than the submarine. And the absolute value, the distance of negative 200 from sea level, is 200 feet. How far away from sea level is negative 200? 200 feet from sea level. So he is both, has a lower elevation and is also further from sea level than the submarine. Han's elevation is greater than the elevation of the submarine. And Han is also closer to sea level than the submarine. So Claire's elevation was greater, and her distance from sea level was also supposed to be greater. So, but for Han, I'm going to choose 25 feet as his elevation. And here's why. Because 25 is greater than negative 100. Positives are always greater than negatives. And what is the distance of 25 from sea level? What is the distance of 25 from zero? Is 25 feet. So he's higher up than the submarine. However, he's still closer to the surface of the ocean. The submarine is 100 feet down, so it's kind of far from the surface of the ocean. He's higher, but he's super close to the ocean. He's only 25 feet away from the sea level. So once again, there's two different things that we're thinking about here. We're thinking about the value of the number, what's greater than and less than. But we're also always, with absolute values, we're talking about that distance from zero. So there's two different components here. Now Lynn's elevation is the same distance away from sea level as the submarines. So if the if the submarine is 100 feet down, that means it is 100 feet away from sea level. So if Lynn is the same distance from sea level, then her elevation must be 100 feet. So 100 is greater than negative 100, and the absolute value of 100 is 100 feet. So her and the submarine are the same distance from sea level. The submarine would have to go 100 feet up to get to the sea level, and she would have to go 100 feet down to get to sea level because she's above it, but they're still the same distance. Now, Priya says her elevation is less than the submarine's, and she is closer to sea level. Is this possible? Explain your reasoning. So her elevation is less than the submarine. So if the submarine is 100 feet down, its elevation is a negative 100 feet. Hers is less. So let's choose a number like negative 125. Okay, so that elevation is less than negative 100, because the larger the negative, the smaller it actually is, the further down it is. But it also says she's closer to sea level. Well, the absolute value of negative 125, or the distance of 125 from 0, is 125 feet from sea level. So this situation is actually impossible. Because if the elevation is less than the submarine, the further down you go, it's less than the submarine, the further away from sea level you're going to go. So if you have to be less than negative 100 feet, then you're just going to be getting farther and farther from the surface of the ocean.